Ja, schönen guten Abend.
So, good evening, and hearty welcome to the Heinrich-Böll Foundation. I'm delighted that there are so many of you here this evening and have come to the event this evening, and that there are other people who are interested and are connected by a live stream. This event will be held in German, and it's going to be translated simultaneously into English. And hello to our English-speaking audience in the stream. My name is Kirsten Krampe. I'm in charge of the Africa division in the Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung, and it's a very great honor for us to have you here with us this evening, Henning Melber, after the publication of your book, The Long Shadow of German Colonialism, Amnesia, Denialism, and Revisionism.
Es ist, wenn ich mich nicht irre, die Deutschland-Premiere.
Okay, this is your Germany premiere, and so we're going to talk about why it was actually published in English a little later.
Der wohl beste deutsche Namibia-Kenner.
And this is the best person who knows German history in Namibia and who has worked on colonial memory and has published a lot of books about Namibia and about Germans' treatment of its colonial lands.
Aber es ist von Dominic Johnson.
This is from Dominic Johnson, who wrote this. I could have wrote this myself, but this is actually written by him. So we're going to talk about. This was actually only in the margin of German history and discussion until now. Not only the historical events of violent historic colonial history, but this was unregarded in Germany and wasn't dealt with. And this is why we talk about the long shadow of colonialism, and this is what it's called by Henning Melber, and he's discussed it quite largely in his work. And Melber wants to work on collective world memory instead of looking at it typically with the asymmetrical colonial power balance. And in Germany, we're not ready to face up to it completely until yet. While working in a multi-perspective memory culture, we are consciously asking the question about the challenges and the potential of working on memory and working on the German colonial history in the present for the future. So we're delighted to have René here this evening, René Egiger. We're delighted you're here with us and that you're going to have this discussion with the leader of the manager in German radio, and also an author, and has also published a book this year, James Baldwin. And so you're also cordially welcome this evening.
Im Anschluss an das Gespräch zwischen den beiden hier
lead over to the topic with both of you here this evening.
Mit uns zu diskutieren,
We
weiter
are
zu
going to
sprechen.
invite them to discuss with us and to ask questions and to comment. Of course, this is not possible in the stream, but it'll be possible with the people who are present in the room. Many of you also remarked that there's also a book stand outside from the wonderful bookstand Intercontinental, who has translated a lot of interesting literature. And there's a lot of good books there that are worthy of reading. And there's also books from Henning Melber and also from René Egiger. And you can purchase or obtain them there. Most of the books by Henning Melber are gone, but if you hurry up after the event, maybe some of them you'll be able to snap them up afterwards. Of course, I've read the book myself, and I can only warmly recommend it. And without further ado, I'm going to give Henning the word, and I hope that you have an inspiring and eventful evening.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you very much. First question, can you hear us? So thank you, Kirsten Kramp, for the wonderful introduction and greeting. I'm just going to speak shortly and just to greet you again, the long shadow of German colonialism. Just to talk about the long shadow cast by German colonialism and, revisionism, denial. This was a book that was written in English, and we're now going to talk about it in German. And the book is going to be translated, and we're just going to talk about the aspects with relation to the language. It's been written in English. And
mich so ein bisschen wohler fühle, dass wir auf Deutsch darüber.
I think it's better that we're talking about it in German. and because I'm more comfortable with it. You know, at the end, we can talk about colonialism.
Mit der englischen Sprache über den deutschen Kolonialismus, nämlich, dass der
sort of like your English expressions about German colonialism. You're a man of the world, but a man who didn't limit his horizons to Germany, but, you know, for many years he grew up in the German Black Forest, and in 1967 he went with the son of a German migrant to Namibia, and also did his high school diploma in Namibia in 1970 in the German school. So then he did journalism training in Munich and then journalism in Windhoek in Namibia. And so in 1974, you got involved in the SWAPO. I think we can talk about this a little, that this was a significant step for you. This is an event you had started getting interested in the middle of the 20s, and then you studied further in Germany. I'm just going to go through it. So you finished your studies in 1977, and then you were habilitated as a university professor in social sciences. This was in 1993 in Bremen. So Henning will use the informal form for speech. So you've been regularly involved in dealing with Namibia's history. And when you look at this CV, you've been there since the independence of Namibia. You've been a professor in Pretoria in South Africa since 2012. And when you look at the different jobs and roles that you've occupied over the last decades and years, in any case, you know, in Namibia, in Germany, in South Africa, in England, and also in Sweden. You've been there since the 2000s. I don't know if I've included all your roles and countries and cities.
Von den vielen Büchern, die Kirsten auch gerade schon angedeutet hat,
of the many books that Kirsten has talked about, I wanted to emphasize two. So one is relevant for this evening, and the other is the wisdom with Z, Racism and Colonial Perspectives, 1992, and then Understanding Namibia from 2014. This is 10 years ago. Before in this book today, Namibia plays a special and significant role. It's the center of the book. And so I'm delighted to be discussing with you here this evening, Henning Melber.
Vielleicht, ins Gespräch zu kommen.
So maybe to get into the nitty-gritty of the discussion, just tell us something about the language. You know, you're talking about German colonialism, and you're from the German Black Forest. Why did you write it in English? How did this happen? From practical reasons, or is there something that we can read into this? So first of all, I'm delighted that we're here discussing this evening. I'm delighted that you agreed to have this discussion this evening. This is an honor for me this evening. So this was an accident in fact, Dominic Johnson was and he wrote me an email and he asked me, why did you publish in English? And my answer was, this was to do with the program involved. This book that you were talking about in Namibia, this was published with Hurst in London, and Hurst is one of the publishing houses that has their own individual publisher. That's not quite so common today. And so my second book, over Dag Hammarskjöld and Africa. And after the second book, we met each other in London, and he said to me, "And what would you like now? What's on your mind?" And so I started thinking, and I thought, in fact, I would love to write something about German colonialism again, and work on it from today's perspective. And so he said, "Go ahead, do it." That's the book. And when you look at it backward in perspective, I'm actually happy that I wrote it in English, because first of this changes and expands the scope. And to my great surprise, there's a lot of English literature, in particular from the USA, that deal with German colonialism, and often with afterwards and the Afro-Germans, and in the Nazi times, and also then in Great Britain, who've dealt with this topic. As one, if I'd written this book in German, it wouldn't have blipped on the radar at all. And so this is a presentation about German sort of narcissism. What I mean is this: in spite of the fact that we want to understand the perspective, but we want to go beyond that and to talk about people who were impacted by German colonialism, and that they have this possibility to get involved in the discussion, that they can understand what's going on. And okay, it's also publicity that sort of like that we can also have this discussion in German that are impactful for post-colonial initiatives in other countries. And so we published it in English, and we can make it accessible through the publication in English. And so, when I look backwards, I think maybe people think that it was sort of like a little strange not to have published in German, but when we're dealing with colonialism as a topic, sort of like it was courageous, but maybe it's courageous to be dealing with the topic at all here in Germany. But now, without being a specialist in literature, but there are, sort of like people are talking about the history of colonialism in German language, or certain aspects of it. But this book is not just an illustration or a description of what happened to a given period of time. It's also to talk about the shadow cast by German colonialism and to talk about the colonial heritage. Could you tell us a little better what the state of things are? Of course, we can talk. There's one chapter in there where we're talking about, sort of like a summary of history, which gives us some base ground to work on. But the heart of the book is, in fact, something else. It's about the shadow. No, we're not talking about the history of German colonialism. Of course, that has to be present. But was a challenge for me from distance. Sort of like I haven't been living in Germany for the past 30 years. It was hard to have the overview about what the state of the discussion is with respect to German colonialism and whether it's been limited to the colonial time. And of course, that's enormous. So like you can't add anything. This part of the book, you couldn't overlook the challenge here, because people who've been dealing with, so like he doesn't know about this or he doesn't know about that, for example. But I just tried to use it as a departure point for the book. But this had started with other people, with Wesser and Vogel in Augsburg. Sort of like we started with the colonialism in 1848. But in principle, we're talking about the fact, like the title says, what are the consequences and impact of German colonialism? What were they for current Germany? What's remained? What deserves attention? And how has it infected us ourselves? And I'm not taking myself out of the equation at all. It was the attempt to find oneself. How do I deal with this? And how do I deal with this legacy without appropriating other people's legacy? How do I find my way into the discussion, through the discussion with a history which is still part of the present and which has been reproduced in my inner values, that I have to challenge and question, and which I can do to a certain extent, but which I can't quite manage, even though you talk to, I've been dealing with this, for the colonial perspective in Germany. I've been talking about this over the past 30 years. But this is the main concern of the book. So it's a report about, of course, it's important to use history as a departure point, but then we talk about what's happened in the Weimar Republic during the Nazi period, in the two Germanys after the Second World War, and then to a great extent certain forms of the consequences as we are witnessing currently today. The Humboldt forums and that Afro-German perspectives, African exotism in sort of like in the German literature, all the different possible manifestations of this. And of course, this was the most important thing. And
Gespräche haben ja immer auch was Unverhofftes, keine Ahnung, was genau passiert.
But there's always a bit of a surprise in each conversation, so we might come back to this aspect in a minute. But I would like to ask about the subtitle of your book, Loss of Memory, Willingness of Denial, Revision. I mean, this is an attempt to put it in German words. So it's true, all this exists. But in the coalition agreement of the government, which is falling apart in Germany right now, there is also a clause getting back to the previous government, and there is an idea of dealing with colonialism. There is a certain group, I don't know how many, but a number of people who are quite open with respect to this approach, including events like this one. So what would you think with respect to your book? I mean, is this just about revisionism on the one hand and liberalism on the other? Well, I wouldn't want to use this black and white painting, and please bear with me if I use this image, because there is a lot of ambivalence, actually, and this is what I try to do right at the beginning of my book. So there are steps. We are moving into the right direction by recognizing certain events of the past, but there are also steps back, which show that the whole thing is quite ambivalent. So there are declarations, statements full of pride and concern, but then if you look at what happens in real life, in politics, you realize that this is a lot of window dressing, actually. But there are also parts in the book where I try to be fair and not only polemic. So I look at aspects and I say this merits to be praised. I mean, I'm not a politician. I don't want to embark on a political adventure here, but I would like to bring this topic forward. I would like to get people's willingness to reflect upon this topic. I mean, they don't have to agree, but I would like them to ponder the ideas. And this is not only about ideology, is what they should understand at the end of the day. It's difficult. I mean, maybe I could quote from my book. I've brought an example. And of course, I've prepared myself, so I've brought a number of leaves, sheets of paper. A very topical example, going back to a minor request in Parliament, which the Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, BSW, presented to the Bundestag earlier this month, and the Foreign Office answered this question, and they add a preliminary remark, which is extraordinary. So I read, the colonial past in Germany for decades was not a topic in politics and in society, nor in politics, nor in society. And if they talked about it, it was about a wrong picture of Germany being a harmless, because only short-term colonial power. The fact that this perception has changed in the last few years is especially due to civil society initiatives. And they continue and say, dealing with the German colonial task is a social, a societal mission, and we've only just begun. And this is what the Foreign Office says. That's the original version of the statement of the Foreign Office. So I have to say, respect. This is a certain self-recognition, I'd say, and I can bear with it. However, and there's always the gap between what you claim and what is real. Because you also find in this preliminary remark the following statement. Since the colonial experience in different societies and groups in society differ, a context-specific dialogue is needed, which has to take place in a certain period of time, and it requires a certain period of time and setting, because it involves the players of the former colonies, but also the representatives from the diaspora and from sciences and academia. So that's true. And then I looked at the bilateral talks between Germany and Namibia, which are about to be concluded, and they only negotiated on the government level. And they did not have the relevant representatives of the groups who suffered from the genocide on board, who therefore say, all this is against us. And they did not get academia and the diaspora on board either. So this statement is very different from what we have seen in the negotiations since 2015. And it cannot be accepted. Well, don't we have to go even further? I don't know about everyday politics. However, I've just heard today that the agreement between Germany and Namibia might be concluded soon because of the elections in Namibia and also because of the transitory situation here in Berlin. So it seems to be probable that the state of this negotiation is fixed. Or what do you think? Well, seems to be the case, right? For the first time ever, in May 2021, the Special Commissioner adopted the joint statement. Sorry, he paraphrased the joint statement, and he initialed it. And at the time, they assumed that in the subsequent months, the two foreign ministers would also sign the declaration. And this was in May of 2021. But then COVID happened, and also a lot of protests in Namibia, also in the ranks of the governing SWAPO, who said that what the declaration said, and at the time they even called it a reconciliation agreement, cannot be accepted. Thus, there have been post-negotiations and follow-up negotiations. The last round took just place in Windhoek. Yeah, right. And there were two aspects which are particularly important. On the one hand, there is criticism because certain groups were not involved at all, neither state actors nor civil actors. And secondly, there are discussions about the sum of about 10 billion, 1.1 billion is the amount. But the idea is to pay the money in the course of 30 years. Now, what happened is the following. The German side said, this is the agreement and we won't negotiate. And then they agreed on post-negotiations concerning an addendum to this declaration. And this is what has happened since May 2021, because there was a lot of protest initially. And there is a group, like the representatives of the NAMA and the Ovaherero, for example, and also of other groups who were concerned, who were immediately affected by the genocide, have been excluded, and they are still excluded. And on the Namibian side, there were talks in order to have these groups also accept the agreement, but the groups did not accept it. And they also negotiated that the sum in question is not a ceiling, and they will also they also succeeded in convincing the other side to pay the money not within 30 years. I mean, 7 billion is what the airport of Berlin cost more. The subway station in my hometown will be 10 billion, will cost 10 billion. The budget for the city of Berlin is 10 billion. So if you have a payment over 30 years, it's much too long. And 1.1 billion for a genocide and $500 million paid within 30 years is not acceptable. I mean, it's less than the annual budget of the Humboldt Forum, right? So we can understand that people in Namibia are angry about this agreement. So they negotiated, they had post-negotiations and agreed on not insisting on that particular sum. We haven't seen the text yet, but there's also an addition to the statements, because initially they said it's a genocide seen from today's perspective, but they decided to do without this particular half sentence, because the argument was a genocide is a genocide. So they won't say as seen from today's perspective, but still they won't call it reparations. The diaspora wanted to be on board and should be on board, especially the Nama families in the Cape province and the Ovaherero in Botswana. The children and grandchildren of these groups have to be included. So from all I know, from all we know, these are the aspects which were negotiated in these post or follow-up negotiations. But this is still not about an understanding of the peoples. And if they don't change this joint declaration, we'll have what I would call a scandalous agreement, i.e. a statement which says Germany says it's sorry for the crimes the country committed in the past. And in the next paragraph it says Namibia accepts this. And in Namibia people say, they didn't ask us. They didn't ask us whether we want to accept this apology. And in order to also give you another example, Hage Geimer, the president of Namibia, died in office early in the month of February, and Federal President Steinmeier participated or was present at the funeral, and in his speech, he said he would have the hope to travel to Namibia again soon and to apologize after the agreement. But people were angry when he said, because people said, well, you need to negotiate about an apology. You cannot go and say, I'm sorry now. I mean, if you recognize that the genocide took place before the negotiations, the first step would be to go and say, I'm sorry for what happened. However, you go and negotiate the form of the apology in order to avoid legal implications concerning the reparations. This is absurd. And this is also continuing the lack of recognition which Joschka Fischer expressed 20 years ago. And this is not an apology which is relevant with respect to the law. Now, if this is the content of the bilateral agreement, it's an agreement of two governments. However, if it comes to bringing the peoples closer and having them understand each other, this does not help. Well, I do understand that you use the word it's a scandal and you don't want to call it ambivalent. We are clearly seeing a certain tension with respect to the quotes you have read and what they mean in real life and to what extent they have become reality. But I would like to move over to another topic in order to come back to the aspect of ambivalence, because we are also talking about institutions, not least in the introduction of your book, because politics is also connected to historical deeds, and it's sometimes difficult to really know what the deeds mean as compared to the words. We have a kind of shrinking government right now, and the current government in Germany, when it comes to history policy, tends to praise itself by saying, we've returned some of the Benin bronzes to Nigeria. Maybe you can tell us a bit more about this. I mean, what do you like and what is the unfulfilled promise here? And why does it make a difference if the German foreign minister travels to Nigeria, where the German Reich had less connections than with Namibia? Excellent example, because it clearly shows the ambivalence or the ambivalences. First of all, let me say, with respect to restitution, Germany is top. It's a leader. People tend to say, why do they have the pyramids in Egypt? And the answer is because they didn't want to bring them to England. And this is actually reality. And even the modest beginnings are more than what we can see elsewhere. Originally, Macron was the one who moved forward. In 2017, he said he'd have the will in his first legislature to return all the cultural goods the country had stolen. And he even nominated Achille Mbembe as his counselor or advisor, who even agreed to becoming the advisor in a time when he was absolutely isolated here and people blamed him. In a way, I'd also call a scandal. But let's get back to the topic you wanted to discuss. A lot has happened in terms of provenance research, and the material conditions were established, which we need. We have institutions and quite a lot of research in the field of provenance research. Exactly. We know better where certain objects and artifacts come from. Yeah, but we are still needing much more information about origins. But yes, there are attempts and they need to be recognized, and that's what should happen. I mean, if I'm dealing with this subject matter once in a while or visit a museum, I think this is only the tip of the iceberg. It's not much, actually. There's so much more we could do. Yeah, right. it's relative. I mean, it's like the glass half full, half empty. What do I see? What do I want to see? But still, it's fair to say that as compared to other countries, Germany in the last few years has tried hard. Maybe not hard enough, and the Benin bronzes are an excellent example here. But they tried. I mean, the numbers, was it 20, 21, 22? The numbers vary, and we've never heard the exact number. But this was more or less the number of Benin bronzes which were returned to Nigeria. But we have thousands of these bronzes in Germany, right? Yep. This was just an attempt to mediate. Well, you're spoiling my game. Yeah, lots of aspects in this context. Yeah, but it was interesting to see the reaction in Germany as far as I could see it from a distance, because people started to fear implications. Baerbock, Claudia Roth, Katja Keul were made ridiculous. They were ridiculed because people said they don't even know that Nigeria was not a German colony. I mean, of course they knew that Nigeria was not a German colony. The assumption that they are suffering from amnesia or denial or revisionism because they were shown as caricatures was a problem.
And when they were given over, which we were able to, which had to be, this was taken out of the Prussian cultural heritage, that some of them were on loan, and as soon as this was made known, they were saying they won't be given back. They're going to stay in Nigeria. Then was the good question, which is also justified: who were they given back to? And then when they made it clear that they were going to be given back to the region and the regional chiefs, but then they were sort of they're corrupt, and sort of like they were trying to. Sort of like they're saying that the heirs of those that were stolen from are being disqualified from getting their cultural objects back. That was one side, and of course the other side, and you've already referred to this. Sort of like there are about 1,200 Benin bronzes which are still in Germany. Some of them are still in private property, and only a few of them have been given back. So when you look at this from a relative point of view, of course, this step, a restitutionary step, is millimeter by millimeter. And this, which brings us to the next point. But of course, we shouldn't question this. Of course, it's a very important and significant symbolic act. But you've got to emphasize the fact that it's symbolic, and that properly intended restitution should be more than just symbols. And the same thing goes for sort of like human skeleton bones and parts, sort of like we don't even know where they're stored. There are hundreds of them. Tanzania is a very prominent example of this. And of course, this is interesting because President Steinmeier, he couldn't apologize in Namibia when he was there. 2 months earlier, in Tanzania, he was there. And he went to the community where the victims of these punitive raids were carried out. And he was able to apologize to their heirs and to their descendants. And of course, you wonder why it's possible in one place and not in Namibia. And of course, the answer is due to the legal implications, with respect to liability and what we've talked about earlier, and these bilateral negotiations. But of course, then the suspicion exists that this is always linked to mass. And of course, you've got to be very careful when you're negotiating, acting, and descripting where are the discrepancies. And of course, unfortunately, the discrepancy is large indeed. You were talking about the restitution of cultural objects, but now you were just talking about human remains. And, there are a lot of human remains still on German soil. Could you give us a few figures on this? Of course, you don't know exactly, but no, there's a lot of numbers flying around, but I don't know whether it's 20,000 I've heard of. But this is always, added to from time to time. But of course, they can be sort of like in repositories somewhere and, lie there undisturbed. We have no idea, in fact. This is one of the areas where we have got to do a lot of homework. And in particular, with respect to East Africa and other countries, they've made requests. You've got the head of, you cut the head off of a chief and you brought him back, and we'd like to have this head back so that we can, give him a proper burial and reconcile him with his ancestors. And this is so few circumstances that show us, if you look at the perspectives, if you look at the perspective of things from a person who's been impacted and bears the consequences of German colonialism and lives in the present, when you're trying to, if you're trying to understand from an empathetical point of view, to have empathy for this, sort of like when you're looking at descendants and ascendants, fathers, grandfathers, grandmothers, and you know that the remains are somewhere, sort of like they've been warehoused somewhere. Just try to imagine, try to feel what this means for those people, in particular, in the spiritual world that they evolve in, because it's not the same as the one we evolve in. Sort of like the restitution of the human remains of their ancestors. This is an integral part of a living culture. This is not just memory culture and memory work. This is also part of the present. And so I don't think that it's too much to ask that this isn't just German. A lot of this, we could be talking about France or in Great Britain or in other countries in the world. It's not just Germany. I think that it's not too much to ask, to expect that one tries to go into it with feeling and with empathy and to try put oneself in the other one's shoes. We are not the ones who had to endure the suffering. But like Charlotte Wiedemann, she wrote in her book, we can try to understand, even when it's impossible. This is a book that you're talking about memory culture, and it was also presented here in this room. And, sort of like I was wondering about these human remains. And just to look at it from a qualitative point of view, perhaps could we also look at the dimensions in the extension of colonialism? One example is sort of like there's political and moral questions that are opened up by all of this, but just to give us a crash course in history about the topic. Germany only had a short and small colonial past, but what were the dimensions involved? It was big enough, for Germany in the 30s, that we still had physical, 1848 and 1915, until the outbreak of the First World War. We belonged to the four great colonial powers, with the British Crown, France, and Russia. Russia's mostly forgotten. And I also place value on this in the discussions with my African friends and contradictors. Sort of like with your selective memories. Sort of like according to this, Russia never colonized anything. What was Russia if it wasn't colonialism? Russia is part of the four powers, but Germany is also part of the four powers. So, it didn't just begin in 1848, the year of the Berlin Conference, when we acquired the different areas and colonies, but it started earlier. Yeah, of course. In Welsanfogger in Augsburg, they profited from slavery and from the commerce in slavery. They had commercial relations with Spain and Portugal and South America. And there was also business people in the 18th and 19th centuries. There were and this mania that noble people in the court in Prussia and elsewhere, that they had, sort of like they also had very respected people, but Africans as philosophers, they brought people over from Africa to show that, they were part and parcel of being a society. They had respected positions. This didn't fall from the sky, as it were. And with the creation of the German Empire, there were also commercial interests and marketing interests, which made arguments and advocated colonialism, which led to the fact that Bismarck in 1884 gave us agreement that business people who had, privately obtained or sort of like, acquired them or stolen them through illegal contracts, that this was part of the German Empire. Sort of like, and they were placed under the protection, in inverted commas, of the German Empire, and they were called protection areas. And of course assumed. So we were talking about the natives, again in inverted commas, with the protection, and then the protection of German commercial interests, and of German plundering interests. And from 1884, this started with Southwest Africa, Cameroon and Togo in the same year, and this was then cemented and consolidated, in the Berlin Conference. Then in 1886, then East Africa, and then the 1890s. Then there was lots of South Sea Islands, a lot, in fact. And in 1900, then there was Kiautschou, which was another commercial area, which wasn't really a colony from a strict sense of the word, but it was part and parcel of the whole thing, and part of colonial violence, where Kaiser Wilhelm II, in June 1900, had the Hun speech when he sent troops to Kiautschou, and he said, "We won't take any prisoners." Which was interesting was that international law was there. This was a clear breach of international law against the Hague Convention, which Germany had signed 1 year just before. And then he sits there and says, "Sorry, we won't take any prisoners here." And this is the gulf between sort of like the colonial violence, which started before this in 1893 in Southwest Africa. 80 women and children were massacred who belonged to the Kovesiname people, and they refused to sign this protectorate contract. And so the German soldiers, they just massacred 80 women and children. And they were saying, we're going to kill you all if you don't sign this agreement. And so this contract was signed, 1896. The Hehe Rising in East Africa, where von Trotha had got his first stars, and then the Kikiu, and then Machi Machi, and then came to Southwest Africa, where in October 1894 gave the genocide against the Herero. So step by step, this was a history of violence, which in particular took place in East Africa and in Southwest Africa, and where it was most manifest in East Africa, the Hehe Rising, the Machi Machi, and then the crazy escapism from Letophobic until the end of the war, which was part of a scorched earth policy with the soldiers. These were all mercenaries out other African territories, and we estimate that in East Africa alone, German colonialism killed 700,000 people. In Southwest Africa, the figure was bigger. Well, it was lower because the population wasn't so big, but according to estimates, we figure that the campaign against the Nama, they took, or the Ohero, a third to a half of Nama, and the Ohero, the 2/3. You know, in figures it wasn't so big, but if you look at it in percentage-wise and proportion-wise, of course, this had huge demographic consequences, which are there until today. Genocide isn't just history in Namibia; it's also part of the present, especially when these groups of population today are an indigenous minority here today, which wouldn't have been in a minority at all had it not happened. And the land that was taken away from them is still mainly in the possession of other farmers that are white, and some of them are German-speaking. So if one tries to look at it from the perspective of people who were impacted from this at the time, then of course this is a reality, and a present reality, that is never taken into account in Germany. It's just overlooked. In addition to the genocide and the other bloody events in East Africa that you've just evoked, there are other forms of violence. I'm just going to give you an example of sort of like beatings, punitive beatings, and the others. In West Africa, this in Toro, how would you place this? You know, sort of like the normality of beating, punishment beating, for example. This is a regime of violence. It's using physical violence as a way of intimidating people to, sort of like that these people are damaged from this punishment for the rest of their lives, not just physically, but also psychologically, or that they pay for it with their life. In Cameroon and Togo, at the time, this is what they said at the time in the other colonial powers. This was the country of the 25, and this is the reference to the common punitive punishment that was handed out then. So 25 bloody cracks of the whip. Sort of like this is 25 lashes of the whip on the naked body. And it was customary that you always added a 26th and one for the German emperor. This is the time when I'd just like to tell something from my own life. I know this proverb from my father. My father emigrated from Togo many years ago to Germany, and he told me about this, and one for Kaiser, that I found interesting from a linguistic point of view, because of course we know what it is. It's clear. It's the normality of brutality, but from a linguistic point of view, it's this is we're talking about the German Empire, but in English, one for the Kaiser. And sort of like in Togo and during my father's lifetime, this was carried out by French teachers. That this was a European project. Just to add something, in Cameroon, there was also the tragic case of Mangabel and Grossotim. Cameroon and Togo were the colonies that were the most that were not daughters, but the sons of the influential families were sent to Germany. This was quite a large number at the time. That at the end of the 1800s, that they went to German schools. Douala Mangabel was one of them. and was also called the German African at home. And there's a fantastic book written about him. He was there and used his intimate knowledge, not just of the German language, but also of the German mentality, as leader of the clan at the beginning of the 20th century, to make demands with respect to the German government, to the imperial government. And in order to, he wrote letters to the emperor, he wrote letters to the government. He knew how to do it. And in Cameroon, when the First World War broke out, there was a kangaroo court which was held at the time for treason, where one of the defenders were Rosa Luxemburg, and she was forbidden from traveling to Cameroon, and she couldn't defend them in front of the court, and condemned to treason and executed as the First World War broke out. And this is the next example of ambivalence. More than 10 years ago, when Hans Christian Ströbele, and one should think of him with respect, in the Bundestag, there was an official rehabilitation for this kangaroo court and for the judicial murders and judicial victims. And it was successfully brought to the end this year by Katja Kohl in Cameroon. But in the German Parliament, if the German Parliament can decide on resolutions about the genocide in Armenia, about the genocide in other parts of the world, until now, in the German Parliament, in the Bundestag, there has been no decision or resolution that was requested by Hans Christian Ströbele at the time to rehabilitate these two victims of justice. There has been no resolution, or at least not to my knowledge, that has faced up to German colonialism in the same way as one would, for example, in Armenian history. And this was the coincidental product that led to this, that Germany then recognized the genocide in Southwest Africa in 2014, 2015. The German Parliament looked at Armenia and followed France's example and had a resolution about the genocide in Armenia and who condemned the denial of this. And Erdogan then spoke out, and with his different channels that he has in Germany, sort of like says, what's happening to you? What are you thinking of? We haven't committed any genocide, but you were the ones who, it's proven, that you carried out the first genocide of the 20th century. And this was dreadful.
This was actually the reason why within weeks they recognized, as a spokesperson of the Foreign Office told the journalists in a press conference later, well, if you want to call it a genocide, call it a genocide. But there is no resolution of the German Parliament until the day. Before I ask a follow-up question to this aspect, I would like to invite the audience to get involved. We are happy and eager to hear your questions. So please, you may want to ponder the idea of asking questions. Now, my question concerning what you have just said, how would you explain that we managed to talk about colonialism and the long shadow within 1 hour, but on many decisive levels, we are still waiting for a recognition, There is no attempt to recognize, to acknowledge, to deal with the past, in spite of the fact that some aspects are being accepted. And by the way, I don't consider your book polemic. It's dedicated, it's committed. Well, I'd say there is an iron curtain in Germany, a different one from the one we used to have, allegedly. And that's the monstrosity of the Holocaust. Now, this iron curtain is still alive in different forms. I don't want to talk about this tonight, but let me tell you what the reason of this mental blockade is. After the war, and I'm part of the generation who grew up in the late 1960s and asked their parents, well, what about the past, by the way? So, at the time, Germany wanted to become the champion, the world champion of memory, of remembrance with respect to the Holocaust. And this led to the blockade. So if there were claims that had been made long ago, and in order to understand the monstrosity of the Holocaust, which was not only directed against the Jews, you have to go back to the allegedly beautiful time of the past. Raphael Lemkin was the first to say so, and he was the one to coin the word genocide. And in his texts and writings about the genocide, he said that German colonialism in Southwest Africa had forms of the Holocaust. And then Hannah Arendt in the 1950s, in The Origin of Totalitarian Systems. So in order to understand the Holocaust, you have to go back to mentality history, and you have to go back to the German systems of control and dominance in the colonies, which doesn't mean that it was predetermined, so an immediate path from Windhoek to Auschwitz, but it means if you are serious and if you really want to explain what happened, you have to start at an earlier point. Briefly, Hannah Arendt, I think she's present. We know that she was a Jewish philosopher who had to flee. But Raphael Lemkin, who was also Jewish, maybe tell us a bit about him. Yeah, a Jewish, Polish lawyer. He grew up in Lem, Liev, and an extraordinary history in a place which was Russian and German and Polish, so it changed within years. There is a great book about this city, because there was another lawyer from the same city at the same period who was committed, and he did not want to use the concept of the genocide in Nuremberg, but crimes against humanity, which is still contested in circles of legal experts, because they say the concept of genocide is less helpful than the idea of the crime against humanity. So, Raphael Lemkin, his whole life he was involved in what Churchill had used to call crimes without a name, and then he coined this concept of the genocide. And he worked on historical processes which led to mass murder, and he also mentioned the German colonialism in Southwest Africa. Right, so he used it as an example in order to coin the concept. And if I may, in addition, because I'm facing an argument today, once I go and say, let's go back further, people tend to misunderstand what I say, and they blame me for not recognizing the uniqueness of the Holocaust. And it's already anti-Semitic if you go and compare, because thus you deny the uniqueness of the violent crime of the Holocaust. But that's not true. Because the argument can only be based on a comparison, because otherwise you cannot use it at all. So this contradicts what people argue. You cannot compare. But you compare, otherwise you couldn't say so. And on the other hand, and this gets me back to the aspect of empathy and the perspectives, from the perspective of the Overherero and the Norma. And without denying the importance and the relevance of the Holocaust, the uniqueness of the violence their ancestors experienced is a given. And this is also to be read in a book published by a publishing house in Berlin 2 years ago, which goes back to the idea of the zero-sum game and says this is not a zero-sum game and this is not anti-Semitic. So insisting on the fact that it's not only about dealing with the Holocaust, but with other mass murders or other mass crimes. Henry Huttenbach, a Jewish genocide scholar, who said 25 years ago, and people criticized him a lot for it. So 25 years ago, genocide studies were the same as Holocaust studies, and only from the beginning of this centering on the comparative, genocide studies were invaded. And they say there was not only one genocide in history, or there is not only one genocide now, but there are different forms of a genocide. So it's a minefield, it's dangerous, and it's really difficult to get openness and transparency in Germany, especially if you refer to the violent history before the Holocaust, before the Nazi regime. Yeah, of course. An applause if you want to. Right. I will refrain from trying to give a summary, and I just ask you whether you have questions.
Erstmal vielen Dank für die Einblicke und die Diskussion.
Thank you for your insights and your discussion. I have a question. The debate about the culture of remembrance or memory culture, as they say, has been very prominent in Germany in the last years. But this amnesia is maybe not only concerning Germany, but also Europe. And you haven't talked about it, really. I mean, you mentioned it in passing when talking about restitution, and these are tiny little steps which Germany undertakes, at least in comparison with other European countries. So I really focused on the debate about memory culture. But I do see it as a European amnesia, and not only a German one, and that's what I wanted to underline, and maybe you could comment on it. Yep. I just realized we've been talking for an hour already. And actually, I wanted to get René on board, and I wanted to have him talk about his work on James Baldwin. So I've tried to figure out how I can do this.
Good.
Yeah, I will ask questions about the second half of the book. Yep, true. And this is once again showing how ambivalent the German example is. When they talked about the apology in 2015, saying sorry for the genocide at the Nama and the Ovaherero, and in many other countries, people were interested and people got in touch with post-colonial initiatives in Germany, and they said, well, how did you get this? Because we would like to have it too. But then they realized in the course of the following years that it was really different from what it looked like in the beginning. In the beginning, it looked great, but it was not. And this is the ambivalence I'm talking about. So if you promise too much, but then don't deliver, you won't find recognition for the first step anymore. People won't recognize that you made the first step, but they criticize you and they tell you that the first step you took was appearing in a different light than it was meant. But there is a lot of lukewarm statements also in other countries. I mean, there is a difference with the former settler colonies where the settlers are the leaders now. I won't talk about the United States, but New Zealand or Australia or Canada do have forms of disputes which can be criticized, and yet there was a powerful movement towards indigenous communities, First Nations, and so on, in terms of protecting their language, their culture. But that's another topic. So it's difficult to compare here in order to go and say, well, Germany should do what they do, because this does not exist here. Which does not mean that you should be satisfied or complacent.
Der rechten Seite des Plenums anfangen. Sind jetzt relativ viele gleichzeitig.
We do have a number of requests for the floor.
Henning und René.
Thank you, Henning.
Ich habe noch mal eine Frage zu den Missionsgesellschaften im Zusammenhang.
I have a question about the missionary societies in the context of colonization, because I do remember that I saw a film when I was a young boy, which had the title "They Have to Be Comforted." Then sie sollen getröstet werden. It was against South African apartheid policy. And when I double-checked a few years ago concerning the history of the film, I learned "Cry My Beloved Country" was the original title. And after what I've heard today, and with respect of the shadow, I would like to bring up the missionary societies again. Well, I'd like to suggest that we collect 3 questions and then listen to the answer.
Ja, vielen Dank auch von mir und für diese großartige Pionierarbeit.
I'd like to thank you for the pioneers' work.
Des langen Schattens und auch des eisernen Vorhangs nochmal anknüpfen.
And I would like to come back to the long shadow and the idea of the Iron Curtain you mentioned, because the long shadow means that this is still concerning us today. People are not recognizing history sufficiently. So I wonder, what about the German uniqueness in terms of violent action and tolerance for very extreme forms of violence? Because the genocide of the Herero and the Ovaherero and the Nama, as well as our support for the potential genocide in Palestine these days, has me ask whether there is a singular willingness to apply extreme violence in Germany or among the Germans. So what do you think? Since you've been dealing with colonialism and genocide studies, what's happening to us today so that we embark on these extremely violent forms time and again? Now let's hear a 3rd question and then the answers.
Es wird noch einen nächsten Set Fragen geben, ich bin ganz sicher.
And we'll have more questions.
Bis jetzt läuft noch niemand weg.
Everybody's running away, so we might have a bit more time. I also have more questions. Felicia Wapa is my name, and I'm from Namibia, from Tunep, which is a city in the north of Namibia. This place is a place where the Germans exploited copper. And I would like to remind you of the environment, the environmental heritage they have left. It has an impact on the people still today, and not only on human beings, but also animals and plants are affected. I went home, and then recently I traveled there, and people warned me and said, don't drink water from the tap, or not too much at least, be careful. That's what they said. So I think that the environment is also an important topic in this political context we are talking about, but it's being excluded. It's not being talked about, but it is a major problem in Namibia, especially the children suffer. Many children have died. And this is not only the German heritage, but this is also the South African heritage. After South Africa left the country, in the region of Tunep, in Pichikoto, we found poison in the plantations, so they left a toxic heritage. Consciously, by the way. And of course, you have a number of different fruits grown on these plantations, like bananas or guayabas. And nobody ever talks about the environment. There is a German lady, young lady. She was presented to me by the German Namibian Society, and she is writing about the environment. She was brave enough to carry out research in this field. Now she's working in Hamburg in a museum, so she's returned. She's not in Namibia anymore. And there is one more aspect I need to mention, because colonialism is not an accident, something which happens just so. But it's planned. Diligently. Because near Hamburg, in Schleswig-Holstein, you have barracks where people were taught what they had to do once they'd arrive in the colonies. So these were training centers or schools which were used for the people who would be the colonizers. And then there is another place, and I don't remember the name, but it's also in Schleswig-Holstein, near Hamburg, where people were trained or recruited in order to train people in Namibia later. So we have to dig deeper, I'd say, when dealing with our colonial history. It's not sufficient to stay on the surface. There are lots of aspects we need to see. And that's what I wanted to say.
Okay, I just wanted to say one thing. This book goes deeper into the nitty-gritty than this discussion does. So the floor is yours. So mission societies, they were very often the pioneers of normal colonialism. They weren't part of the program and the plan. They just went there. So they were pioneers of colonialism, but there were mission societies, had physical presence in the countries, This, yeah, sort of like then they had the need to be protected by the countries of origin. And so they were influential actors. I'm saying actors and stakeholder actors because they were all men then. Of course, there were very few women. So I'm saying actor. That had a lot of local dynamic influence. And not just, wasn't just wishy-washy, you know, sort of like they also had weapons with them sometimes in West Africa, for example. Or they also fermented strife between different communities to destabilize things in order to have the criteria for the intervention of the protectorate powers. But there is another aspect that must not be overlooked. The individual behavior, where this plays a role also. There were missionaries in different societies that were very self-critical and were almost, you know, at the edge of anti-colonialism in their behavior. You know, I don't think we can paint all missionaries with the same brush. In this, you know, sort of like this, the measured person, there's a film which was controversial in German, but there's a scene in there which talks about a missionary in German Southwest Africa who requests protection for the Ahorero, and they're taken from him and they're sent to concentration camps. Missionary Kuhlmann. This missionary did really exist, and there were three other missionaries that were condemned for the protection. And there are documents in the archives that are there. And they were vehement in their criticism against German violence. And they defended the resistance and the uprisings of the indigenous peoples. So as an institution, missionary societies were helpful to the colonialism, but different members, of course, had adopted very different positions, and they were defenders of the indigenous peoples. The second question you've got to be careful when you're answering it. How ready is there a special character of Germans which incites them to violence? I don't think that there's Germans have a special burden to carry in history. You can't just call it as a special. You can't just explain it. You can't just explain it as an exception. Colonizers, First World War, they got the colonies taken away. They felt that they were that the value was taken away from them. It was instrumentalized, and then they tried to instrumentalize this in East Europe. But this could probably have happened to any other colonial power. But you know, colonizers were colonizers. Look what the British did in India. Look what the others did. And you take other examples. Under several different conditions or factors, it could have happened in other colonial countries, because colonialism and the past brings about a mentality that makes one ready to absolute unfettered violence as an integral part of its being. And they would have been, this would have occurred in other countries had the conditions been there for it. I don't think that the Germans are special on this, that Germans are unique in their violence and that they're different from others. I think you've got to see why. What were the factors that occurred? What were the circumstances? But this doesn't mean, or at least I think, that this could only have happened to Germans because they are uniquely attuned to this sort of violence. When they do something, they do it properly. No, I think this could also have applied to the others. If you look at the Belgian king and how he behaved in the Congo, sort of like sort of German colonialism was almost harmless compared to this. Just to This is not in any way to relativize violence in any way. It's just to put it into its overall context. The reference is absolutely justified. Colonialism has structural consequences in the long term, not only in the way that people are made up, but on both sides, not just the victims, but also the perpetrators. Franz Vallot, sort of like if you looked at the damned of the earth, if you look at this book, sort of like when he worked as a psychiatrist in Algeria in the 50s, when he looked how people who exerted violence against other peoples, it didn't just have irreparable consequences for the people who'd suffered it, but also for the perpetrators. You can't overlook this. This is also closely linked to something to do with James Baldwin, but just an aside here. So now, with respect to environmental destruction, of course it starts with this as well. And this mythology ways of talking about a civilizatory mission. This was a plundering of people and natural resources in the country. And Namibia is an example of this. Of course, there are lots of examples in all regions of the world. Don't you want to say something about James Baldwin? Yeah, just one sentence. You've just talked about Vernon. To say that that torture and violence doesn't just make the victim suffer, it also makes perpetrators suffer. James Baldwin in America has been writing in America since the 40s. It was important for him to make clear that the racism that occurred then in its various variants didn't just damage African Americans, it also damaged the perpetrators. And so I think that this is very related ways of thinking. And so now the possibility is there for questions from the room again. So let's start on the left side of the room again. So I just wanted to make a linguistic commentary. So genocide and, so like we're talking about crimes against humanity and not just genocide, but also, I don't know how this was translated, crimes against humanity and genocide, and in the meaning of incredibly grotesque behavior, criminal actions. Sort of like this is another level of inhuman behavior. And I want that all journalists who are here, or Heinrich-Böll, or the Greens, when you see crimes against humanity, you can't. This is a grotesquely bad or a false translation. It's not mankind, it's humanity. It's different. So we'll take 3 questions from the room.
Also mir ist die Frage ja schon etwas früher gekommen.
So I had the question earlier, and then the question of the uniqueness or special nature of German colonial history compared to the others, compared to the other colonial powers. In fact, I'm wondering why this is barely referred to or barely included in the overall perspective. But this is a history of the development of humanity. And I can see here the beginnings of capitalism, the means of production and the infrastructures and structures that you were talking about, that this doesn't only affect Germany. On the contrary, this started in other places entirely. And I think that in this context, this should also be integrated as part of the discussion and part of the question. When we're looking for the question that I'm always wondering about, as society, as people, as states, how can we do such things?
der immanenten Gewalt in
You've talked about the sort of like the inherent violence in colonialism, but on the other side, there was also a lot of adventure there as well that played a role at the beginning.
Also kann man nicht außen vor lassen, sondern
sort of like
erst wieder im Zusammenhang mit der entsprechenden, ja, letztlich Produktionsweise.
Sort of like this was the production means of production that one applied and used in the different countries. So last question.
Dankeschön.
Thank you. I had a question
zu dem Entschließungsantrag, den Sie erwähnt hatten in Bezug auf die
to Armenia and the resolution, the draft resolution that you were talking about that was in the parliament and that it wasn't decided upon in the German parliament or debated. And what would this type of resolution have as consequences, and in particular with respect to teaching curricula, or to the very narrow description, a way of dealing with memory culture in Germany? Would this type of resolution lead to, political? Would this be a political or symbolic step? Perhaps you could give us your perspective or evaluation of this. Thank you for the reference to the translation. I said mankind because this was used in crimes against humanity are indeed something different. This is, you must understand that this is much more, has a different meaning for mankind. It's hard to get used to the idea that adventure, of course, this was due to an expansion of Europe to the rest of the world, and the rule. These were professional people who gained money, who earned money. They weren't looking for knowledge; they were looking for money. They were trying to use these areas that they discovered. It wasn't just all about discovery, but of course, when you look at the earliest trips, there was one early trip from Kolb about the Cape of Good Hope, and he was really open and curious. He was describing things that he found were quite unusual, but he didn't, sort of like, look at the way that they rub each other with earth or to protect themselves from. He thought that this was really exciting. He tried things. He was curious. He hadn't a hierarchized perspective of people. He wasn't, which was part of the rationale of the Enlightenment. And there is a short chapter in this. You can confirm this. Before I get to German colonialism, there is a short chapter in there about the rationality of the Enlightenment and the expansion of Europe to the rest of the world. As preparation, the transition from a feudal society to an early and then a high capitalized society. When we look at the Enlightenment, this hierarchization in Sweden there was Carl von Linné. He, look at his contribution to anthropology with this classification of humans, people. You can't separate this. You can just look at one thing in a more concentrated manner than the other, but you have to see the link between them, that there is no contradiction between adventure with the rest, but it's a transition from one to the other. Sorry, the person doesn't have a microphone.
Man wird Sie nicht hören können.
You can't hear you.
Aber vielleicht zur dritten Frage.
But maybe we could answer the third question.
Das Buch ist keine Kapitalismuskritik.
The book is not a criticism of capitalism. It's only a criticism of capitalism to the extent that it's criticism of colonialism. But, colonialism and capitalism do belong together, of course. I think that's clear to see. Okay, resolution of the German Parliament. I think that it could play a significant role, not in a material way, but in terms of positioning. And to the extent that how does it only concern that the federal president in Tanzania or Namibia, he apologizes there, but that is not the first step in Germany about the Germans' role in that as a memorial to what the Germans feel about it. And that we recognize there are things that we've got to apologize for in history. This also has a benchmark in the internal political space. And of course, the resolution of the parliament plays a role in this regard. That and it would be a different way of working on colonialism. And through the resolution, of course, then this would be transported into public debate and discourse. This would become a topic. If the German parliament, pardoned the people who were murdered judicially years ago, if they recognized this as a judicial error, then it's a declaration with respect to German public life, not just with respect to the descendants of the people in Togo and Cameroon. If we were to take another example, if the German parliament were to resolve that it is necessary, that it is a memorial that should be a memorial to place a memorial to the victims of German colonialism, then this becomes an internal political form of working over these topics. That, of course, we're recognizing the others as a victim, but the history of the perpetrators is also there, and that's the difference. This is different to the work that we do with respect to the Holocaust. And why is it not possible to compare them when we're talking about working on history of German colonialism? And of course, the resolutions of the German parliament also belong to this process. Okay, do you have a last round of questions? Last round?
Ja, vielen Dank. Sie haben eigentlich in der vorletzten Antwort schon kurz Europa erwähnt. Und als Osteuropa-Historikerin, wenn ich denke an die Long Shadow of Colonialism,
your answer previously.
Europa nicht denken, irgendwie
and actually we do have to think Eastern Europe.
Erfahrungen, und zwar schon
im 19. Shaped by the colonial experience in the 19th century, but also later.
Und Zeit und Kolonialismus auf jeden Fall so einen großen Konsens darüber gibt, Historiographen.
So there is a consensus in this respect. So I wonder, does Eastern Europe play a role when it comes to the long shadow of German colonialism?
Für Sie genau in diesem Buch eine Rolle gespielt haben, und wenn ja, welche?
Noch mehr Fragen? Oder dann wäre da noch eine.
Okay. Können Sie bitte für uns das Humboldt-Forum einordnen in diesen langen Schatten?
Could you maybe talk about the Humboldt Forum in the context of the long shadow?
Danke für diese Frage. Dann wird das doch nichts mit 7:45.
Thank you, but this question will probably end later.
Das war bisher so harmonisch.
Well, there was such a lot of harmony here. Do we have to do this?
Ja, ich habe mich gefragt, welche Folgen der Kolonialismus oder der deutsche Kolonialismus.
What impact does German colonialism on society in Germany today? And what do you see in German discourse and debates?
Was man da vielleicht als Einzelperson auch reflektieren kann.
And what can I reflect being an individual? May I, please, just one sentence, even more if you want to. This book is not a story, but talks about the relationship of colonialism and enlightenment. And there's a whole chapter about the post-colonial development and West Germany. And also a chapter about the relationship between Germany and Namibia. Just so that you know. Oh, by the way, he doesn't get a commission for placing this ad here for the commercial. Now, colonialism and Eastern Europe, I'm not an expert in this field. I know that in the 19th century, Eastern Europe also mattered. In the discussion in Prussia, with respect to the extension to Eastern Europe, but it would be too risky if I pretended that I know what I'm talking about here. However, I do know more about the colonial propaganda in the empire and how it was used as a tool, not only in the Weimar Republic, but also in the empire with the reorientation, with respect to the reorientation to Eastern Europe. Volk ohne Raum is the title of a novel written by Hans Grimm. And this novel was written after the end of colonialism, and at the World Exhibition in Los Angeles, the Nazis showed this book as the only one in the early 1930s, and it was meant to symbolize the greatest cultural achievement of Germany. So this motto was used with respect to the reorganization of colonialism in Eastern Europe. And in 1906, Gustav Frenssen, a northern German writer, wrote a novel with the title Peter Moors Fahrt nach Südwest. 450,000 copies were printed, and the last edition was distributed in Stalingrad to the soldiers in the pits. So I don't want to insinuate that there was a linear development from Windhoek to Auschwitz, but you have to see the history of mentalities and ideologies in order to understand this history. You have to go back to this time. Same goes for the anthropology, like the institute in the Innenstraße, the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, as it was called. This would not have been possible without German colonialism. And it was an important part in the shaping of the idea of the dominant human being, the Herrenmensch, which the Nazis purported. Righto, the Humboldt Forum.
Am liebsten würde ich nichts dazu sagen.
Well, actually, I would love to not say anything at all.
Überhaupt schon die Idee,
to not comment. I mean, the idea of reimagining the castle, irrespective of what it houses, is something you will have to deal with seriously. Same goes for the church in Potsdam, which is being rebuilt, including reminiscences of the time. Now, many years were spent in order to talk about what should happen in the Humboldt Forum and how. And there were interesting shifts, actually, and this offers me an opportunity to tell you that the day after tomorrow, the Humboldt Forum will open an important exhibition about the traces leading to East Africa. So I'm trying to be fair. I hope you note it, right? So they show that there are certain learning processes in this attempt to deal with the history. I could do without the Humboldt Forum. I would have preferred other forms of commitment or dedication. And all these years of struggles with Patzinger and you name them. You say one thing, you do something else, you mean it in a different way. All this debate, I mean, this is the restitution or constitution of a history which merits to be preserved. This goes for the external facade. So I'm very grateful that there is a critical debate about this institution and its home. And this is probably the most important role the Humboldt Forum plays. It's a trigger, an incentive for a debate which otherwise would not have happened, I say. And thus triggers reflection, which I welcome. This might be the fairest way to answer the question and avoid any problems in trying to answer your question.
Die Folgen des Kolonialismus auf
the influence in the German society today. I mean, that's actually what the book is about. In order to summarize it in different words, well, yeah, actually, I don't know. It's not necessary. I think it has been said repeatedly in our conversation tonight.
Kapitel über Colonial Germany andeuten. So.
Well, maybe you could just briefly comment on the chapter of colonial Germany.
Ich denke, die hauptsächliche Folge ist die.
Well, the most important impact is the fact that people don't talk about the consequences of German colonialism, as I tried to make clear in my opening remarks, including the impact on us, including forms of racism, forms of ways of dealing with black Germans.
Eine Fortschreibung von Kolonialismus.
This is a continuation of colonialism in a modified form, without consciously or openly mentioning colonialism. It's rather like going back to the beginning. So this would be an important reference I'd like to mention. And also questioning oneself, also in a different sense of colonialism. I mean, to what extent are we colonized? Asymmetric power relations and power structures in a society cannot only be seen in the North-South relationship, but in each and every society, in the South and in the North. And this, too, is a challenge. So we should feel challenged to reflect on colonial structures and which kind of power is being reproduced, which cannot be automatically labeled colonial and yet is similar. And if dealing with German colonialism makes you reflect, I'd say that's the way it should be. I'm happy. Now it sounds like a concluding remark, but I would like to ask a very last question in order to get a short answer. I would like to ask you to be brief in your answer.
Den Ort, von dem aus du sprichst.
Could you
Denn es ist ja
briefly come back to the venue where you speak or the place from which you speak? I mean, more than half of your life you spent in Namibia, and you have lots of relations, but then there's also Swabia and Germany. Is that a problem? Or, I mean, what about your speaker position? Yeah, well, no, it's not problematic at all. It's not a problem. This was in my mind when I started writing the book. I'm a Swabian, Swedish, Namibian. And that's the author who wrote the book. There are only individual places where people can relate to whatever surrounds them, to whatever is their environment. The main problem for me was that I am dealing with a topic that concerns myself. And I deal with it because it concerns me too. And I want to do it in a form so that I don't appropriate other people, because that's a danger. I want to hear others, but I don't want to appropriate others. And that's difficult, which is why I have these reflections at the beginning about this topic. It's maybe an attempt to play it safe and in order to tell people, yes, I have thought about it, which does not mean that I manage to avoid each and every moment that could be embarrassing. But of course, it's always about my own experience, about everybody's experience. I mean, being a white member of a black liberation movement, to learn that it's also racist if you don't contradict, even if you want to contradict. I could give you hundreds of examples, but the key statement is everybody has to determine for themselves what their point of departure is in order to deal with the topic, and that's all I can say right now. Okay, let's continue in smaller groups.
Ich würde gerne noch was zum Schluss zitieren.
I would like to quote at the end.
Zweimal.
Bitte.
Apologies.
Eine Referenz an dich.
Okay, I would like to quote a reference to you and to your dedication and your book about James Baldwin. I mean, our books were published more or less at the same time. I did not copy René, but I also wrote about James Baldwin. In the collection, I'm Not Your Negro, and I wonder how this is being translated into German. This text was published. Yeah, that's going to be the next evening here at the foundation. Okay, so Baldwin writes, history is not the past, it's the present. We encourage, we promote, and we are our history. We cannot get out of the shadow of the past. However, we can recognize and acknowledge the shadow and try to shed a light at the darkness. Now, this would have been a program for me in order to write my book. And then there is one voice I would like to use at the end of this event. Now, in view of naming or renaming streets, and on 2nd December 2022 in the Afrikanisches Viertel in Berlin, Sharon Dodua Otu wrote a poem with the title Remembering. And this poem ends by saying that we want to breathe. Tears are shed when we laugh and when we cry. And the earth is full of it. Some of us do it. They remember. We give our names to German streets. And it happens anyway, whether the others want to see it or not. And my wish would be, wouldn't it be nice if all Germans had merited this gift? Thank you very much, Henning Melber.
Thank you. Mein technischer Hinweis sollte...
A bit of housekeeping at the end. I just wanted to tell you, you can move outside and be with us. And I want to thank you for listening and for having been with us here tonight.